Florida reported 186 coronavirus deaths today. That is a single-day record for the state. It is also, though, the third day in a row with fewer than 10,000 new cases there. And what about the baseball situation in Miami? The MLB is putting the Marlins season on hold through Sunday after several players and coaches tested positive for the coronavirus. NBC News correspondent Sam Brock is outside Marlins Park in Miami. Sam, the Yankees and Phillies series postponed as well because Philly is the last place the Marlins played. What's the latest from the team there in Miami? What's going on?
The latest, Allison, is there was deep concern this would affect not just the Miami Marlins, but potentially all of Major League Baseball. When we sort of interfaced with the Marlins earlier, we found out that they were, in fact, pausing Major League Baseball was the rest of these games, and we weren't sure exactly what the league was going to say. Then we found out it was going to be the rest of the Marlins games through Sunday and the rest, as you said, of the Phillies-Yankees games. But there was concern at one point this could be a league-wide stoppage. And the reason that I say that is because Rob Manfred, who is the commissioner of Major League Baseball, had already said if one team cannot field enough players where they become competitive or lack of that ability, that would be a threshold for stoppage or changing plans. It appears that's happened, but what they're doing right now is buying the Marlins some time. The latest right now, Allison, this is kind of surprising. If you take out the Miami Marlins, no other team in Major League Baseball has had a positive test since Friday. This is exclusive to the Marlins. Wow. They have 4 more that were reported today, which gets you up to 15. That is about half of the team's traveling roster has contracted COVID-19. So they're out of it. What Major League Baseball does not want to do right now is to see this obviously jump to any other teams. Can they isolate the situation here and allow other teams to continue playing and then get the Marlins back in 4 or 5 days? That's the goal. Clearly, Major League Baseball is not throwing anything in for the season yet, but there has to be great trepidation right now, knowing how fragile the situation is.
Oh, Sam, it's incredible to hear those numbers on just one team. Really unbelievable. All right, let's talk about what's going on in Florida more broadly right now. Nearly 600 people hospitalized there in the last 24 hours. What's going on with the state's coronavirus curve right now?
Right. When it comes to hospitalizations, I think it would be fair at this point to say that Florida has plateaued. They peaked at about 9,400 COVID-19 patients. That was about a week ago. Right now, they're just over 9,000 at 9,011. That's the latest figures that we have. It's gone up, it's come down, it's gone up a little bit in recent days, but it's plateaued. In Miami-Dade, we peaked at 2,300 COVID patients. We're now below 2,100. So you're seeing the right trend lines there. The positivity rates are always that sort of word and metric that you look at because you want to know how widely this is being transmitted in the community. Still at about 15% for the state. If you take out the percentage of people who had already tested positive, more like 11%, that's down several percentage points from where we were a week ago at this time. So these are all good signs, Allison. But still, you mentioned the fatalities. 186 was the latest reported number. That's more than 6,100 for the state. That is a staggeringly large number. But it also does not mean that this all happened in the last 24 hours. The governor himself has already said that when you're looking at the death totals per day, sometimes they're collecting deaths that came weeks or several weeks prior. So it's not necessarily a snapshot of what's going on right now. We do know in its totality, it's a very humbling figure.
Sam, we know the governor had a briefing today as well. What else did he have to say?
He talked about the fact that he feels like in the next couple of weeks, Florida is going to be in a much better place than it is right now. And that is entirely possible. He also discussed trying to get more shipments of remdesivir, which is a drug that helps people who are struggling right now with COVID-19. The state had shortages. He's bringing more of that in. All of this is true, but 15% as a state positivity rate is exceptionally high. So what they're hoping right now is that the numbers that are plateauing are going to continue to improve. But you still have shortages right now of healthcare workers, Allison, which is a severe problem. You still have extremely flammable community-wide transmission at this moment. And so until that ceases, we're not plateauing, but actually going down. I don't think anyone is waving a victory flag at the moment.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.